The mud is the first thing you notice. It is not just earth. It is a freezing paste that has eaten through the soles of your shoes and welded your wool socks to your skin. You are 21 years old, huddled in the corner of a damp, requisitioned school gymnasium, wrapped in a Wehrmacht coat that smells of wet wool, stale sweat, and the sharp, metallic tang of menstrual blood you cannot wash away. Then, the doors crash open. A beam of light cuts through the darkness. A flashlight, blindingly bright, wielded by a silhouette in olive drab. Haus! Antreten! Outside, now! The command is a mix of broken German and barking English. Your stomach drops. A physical contraction so violent it feels like a punch to the gut. Around you, there is the rustle of straw and the whimper of waking women. You stand up, your knees knocking together. Not a figure of speech, but an uncontrollable, rhythmic tremor caused by a caloric deficit and primal terror. The lice itching at the nape of your neck are forgotten. As you stumble into the freezing pre-dawn air, watching the breath steam from the mouths of the guards, you are certain of only one thing. You are being marched to a wall. You do not know yet that the weapon in the soldier's hand is not a rifle, but a canister of DDT. The gray zone of captivity. To understand the panic in that schoolyard, you have to understand the specific, chaotic geography of Germany in the spring of 1945. This was not a surrender. It was a total somatic collapse. The German Reich didn't just sign a paper, its spine snapped. For the Wehrmachthelferinnen, the female auxiliaries who had staffed the switchboards, the anti-aircraft searchlights, and the administrative offices, the end of the war was a descent into a legal and physical void. By May 1945, millions of German soldiers were surrendering, but the women occupied a strange, dangerous gray zone. They wore uniforms, field gray, with the eagle insignia, which made them targets. Yet, under the Geneva Convention, their status was murky. Were they combatants? Were they civilians? The Americans solved this bureaucratic headache with a new label, DEF, or Disarmed Enemy Forces. This designation was not just paperwork, it determined your caloric intake. A POW was entitled to the same rations as the capturing army's base troops. A DEF was not. For the women rounded up in the Ruhr pocket or captured in Bavaria, this meant the immediate cessation of the predictable military world. The Kommissbrot, the dark, dense rye bread of the German army, disappeared. The supply trucks stopped coming. The infrastructure of hygiene, the soap allotments, the hot water, the latrine details, vanished overnight. You were no longer a signal corps operator with a rank and a bunk. You were a body to be counted, herded, and processed. The roads were clogged with a river of humanity, retreating units, refugees pushing carts, and American convoys roaring past in deuce-and-a-half trucks that smelled of high-octane gasoline and exhaust. In the chaos, rumors became the primary currency. One camp whispered that the Americans were sending all women to the brothels of North Africa. Another claimed that anyone with an SS rune on their paperwork was being shot on sight. The reality was less dramatic, but more physically grinding. You were moved from holding pen to holding pen, sometimes a meadow surrounded by barbed wire, sometimes a bombed-out factory floor. You slept on concrete or wet earth. You learned the unique, crushing fatigue of waiting for an order that might never come. Shivering in a uniform that had become a liability, stripped of the insignia that once gave it meaning. The cage and the mud hell. If you were lucky, miraculously lucky, you ended up in what the prisoners called the Golden Cage. These were the established camps, often former Wehrmacht barracks repurposed by the U.S. Army. Here, there was a roof. There was the smell of heating oil. There was the staggering, confusing abundance of the American trash cans, where a prisoner might salvage a tin can that still had the sugary residue of peaches or the grease of Spam. In these places, the suffering was psychological, boredom, uncertainty, the humiliation of captivity, but the body remained relatively intact. But for hundreds of thousands, the reality was the Rheinbagenlager, the Rhine Meadow camps. This was the mud hell. The Americans, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of prisoners, over 1 million in the Rhineland alone, fenced off vast stretches of open farmland along the river. There was no barracks, there were no tents, there were no latrines, there was only barbed wire and the sky. If you were a woman caught in this net, the physical experience was one of total exposure. When the rain came, the earth turned into a viscous, sucking quagmire. To sleep, you didn't find a bunk, you dug a hole in the ground with your hands, a tin spoon, or a helmet, trying to create an erdhella, earth cave, to escape the wind. You huddled together in preservation piles, bodies pressed tight to share calories, shivering violently as the damp seeped through the wool of your uniform and into your bones. Then came the hunger winter of 1946-1947, one of the coldest in European history. The German supply chain was dead. The caloric intake for a normal consumer in the occupation zones dropped to between 1,000 and 1,200 calories a day, often far less in the camps. Hunger ceased to be a sensation and became a state of being. It wasn't just a growling stomach, it was a darkening of the vision when you stood up too fast. It was the body consuming its own muscle tissue. The thigh muscles atrophied until walking became a conscious, deliberate effort. The fat pads behind the eyes dissolved, making them look sunken and haunted. You stopped thinking about the past or the future. Your entire universe narrowed down to the immediate, desperate somatic need for carbohydrates. A crust of bread was no longer food. It was life itself, guarded with a ferocity that stripped away all social niceties. The hygiene crisis. The history books talk about treaties and borders. They rarely talk about the specific, agonizing mechanics of being a woman in a field of mud with no plumbing. For the Wehrmachthelferinnen, the collapse of the Third Reich was measured in the disappearance of cotton. When the supply depots were bombed or overrun, sanitary napkins vanished. In the Rheinwiesenlager, menstruation became a logistical emergency. You tore strips from your undershirt until you had nothing left. You scavenged newspaper, moss, or dry leaves, stuffing them into your underwear, praying they wouldn't shift or leak. The chafing was constant, raw, red skin rubbing against coarse wool, stinging with every step. Then the water ran out. You couldn't wash the rags. You had to dry them in the sun or against your own body heat, hiding them from the guards and the men in the adjacent pens. The smell of old blood became a source of paralyzing shame, a somatic signal that made you want to shrink into the earth. Then came the itching. It started as a tickle at the waistline or under the armpit. Within days, it was a burning, crawling torment. Kleiderlaus, body lice. They didn't live on the skin, they lived in the seams of your uniform, descending to feed on your blood when you were still. The nightly ritual was not prayer, but cracking. You would sit in the dim light, turn your coat inside out, and run your thumbnails along the seams. Knack, knack, knack. The tiny, sickening pop of a louse being crushed. The welts on your skin bled and scabbed over. Sleep became impossible. You would doze off, only to wake up scratching until your nails were black with dried blood. But the ultimate terror wasn't the itching. It was the hair. Rumors tore through the camps that the Americans were shaving the heads of all women found with lice. In 1945 Germany, a shorn head was not just a medical measure. It was the mark of the social outcast, the collaborator, or the fallen woman. The fear of the razor was visceral. Women would frantically braid their hair tight against their skulls, hiding it under caps or helmets, terrified that a single visible louse would lead to the shearer's chair and the permanent branding of their identity. The material shock. For a woman who had spent the last 3 years washing with sand and wearing remade uniforms that smelled of wet sheep, the arrival of the Americans was not just a political shift. It was a collision with an alien material universe. The shock was primary, sensory, and overwhelming. It began with the bread. To a German stomach conditioned by the war, bread was Kommissbrot, a dense, sour, almost black brick of rye and potato flour that required serious chewing and sat heavy in the gut. When the first American rations appeared, the women were baffled. They held the slices in their dirty fingers. It was blindingly white. It was impossibly soft, so spongy that if you squeezed it, it stayed compressed. Many women didn't believe it was bread at all. They thought it was cake or perhaps raw, unbaked dough. Putting it in your mouth was a confusion of the senses. It tasted sweet, almost chemically so. It dissolved without chewing. For a body in starvation mode, this Wonder Bread was a shock to the glycemic index. It hit the bloodstream like a drug, but it didn't fill the hollow ache in the same way the heavy rye did. It was like eating air. Then there was the smell of the golden cage. The American sector didn't smell like the Europe they knew, of coal smoke, unwashed wool, and damp plaster. It smelled of Virginia tobacco, sweet and toasted, high-octane gasoline, and above all, real coffee. Most of these women hadn't tasted real bean coffee since 1941. They had been drinking mukafuk, a bitter, gritty substitute made from roasted acorns, chicory, or barley. The scent of brewing Nescafe wafting from the guard huts was physically intoxicating. It triggered a deep, salivary memory of a world before the bombs, of cafes, of porcelain cups, of civilization. It was a cruel reminder of how far they had fallen. But survival required adaptation, and the Wehrmachthelferinnen became masters of material improvisation. The most vital skill was the tin can stove. You couldn't just eat the cold rations, the body craved heat, but there was no fuel. So you watched the GIs. You watched what they threw away. The Americans were shockingly, sinfully wasteful. They tossed away tin cans that still had food in them. They discarded wooden crates. The women learned to take a discarded number 10 tin can from the mess hall trash. With a nail, or a sharp rock, and a rock for a hammer, they punched ventilation holes near the bottom. They scavenged tiny twigs, wood chips, or even twisted twists of paper for fuel. This little hobo stove could boil a cup of water in minutes. The bucket trick became legendary. If you could get your hands on a metal bucket and a bit of wire, and if you were in a camp with electricity, a luxury, you could rig a immersion heater by attaching wires to two metal plates separated by a piece of wood. Dropped into the water, it would boil a bucketful for washing or laundry in 10 minutes, often blowing the fuses of the entire camp sector in the process. This was the daily reality, a strange juxtaposition of high-tech American waste and Stone-Age German ingenuity. You walked around in a coat infested with lice, dreaming of the nylon stockings you saw in American magazines, while boiling water in a trash can to wash the only pair of underwear you owned. The cloud of white. The tension in the camp reached its breaking point on a Tuesday morning. The rumor mill had been churning all night. The trucks are here. The special unit is here. They are lining us up by the fence. For women who had lived through the propaganda of the terror bombing and the whispers of the final solution, the sight of men in masks unloading canisters was a trigger for primal panic. You stood in the line, your heart hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. The woman next to you was weeping silently, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. You clenched your hands into fists, digging your nails into your palms to keep from screaming. The Americans moved efficiently, shouting instructions that were lost in the wind. Open coats, hats off. You watched the soldier approach. He held a metal device with a pump handle, a dusting gun. It looked terrifyingly like a flamethrower or a gas dispenser. He stopped in front of the woman ahead of you. He shoved the nozzle down the back of her collar. Whoosh! A cloud of white dust exploded around her head. She coughed, squeezing her eyes shut, waiting to die. Then he moved to you. You held your breath. The cold metal nozzle touched your neck. You flinched. The pump sounded, a mechanical thwomp. A blast of freezing cold powder hit your skin, rushing down your spine, coating your sweaty back. He pumped it up your sleeves. He pumped it down the front of your blouse. Lift skirt, he barked. You obeyed, trembling with humiliation. The dust hit your inner thighs, a shocking, dry cold against the raw skin. You stood there, engulfed in a white haze, waiting for the burning, the choking, the end. But the burning never came. Instead, there was a smell, a sharp, chemical, antiseptic scent. It smelled like a hospital. It smelled like clean. You opened your eyes. You looked at the women around you. They were all standing, alive, looking like ghosts covered in flour. The panic began to recede, replaced by a sudden, bewildering realization. It wasn't poison. It was DDT. The itching stopped. For the first time in months, the crawling sensation on your skin ceased. The Americans hadn't come to kill you. They had come to kill the lice. The humiliation of the process, the invasion of your clothes, the public dusting, clashed violently with the relief. You stood in the white cloud, covered in the dust of the victor, feeling a strange, chemically induced safety. The taste of defeat. The chemical smell of DDT still clings to your skin, but now there is a new scent. It cuts through the sharp disinfectant. The smell of yeast and sugar. You're sitting near the perimeter wire, exhausted, your stomach cramping with the familiar hollow ache. A guard approaches. He is young, perhaps no older than you, chewing on something with a rhythmic bovine jaw movement. He stops. He looks at you. There is no hatred in his eyes, just a casual curiosity. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a wax paper package. He unwraps it. It's a sandwich. 2 thick slabs of that impossible, snowy white bread. He breaks off half. Here, he says. He extends his hand through the wire. Your training tells you to refuse. Your pride tells you to look away. But your body betrays you. Your hand shoots out, snatching the bread before your mind can process the indignity. You hold it. It feels like a sponge, light and airy, lacking the heavy gravity of the black rye bread you were raised on. You take a bite. The shock is immediate. It doesn't taste like bread. It tastes like cake. It is sweet, soft, and dissolves on your tongue without any effort. There is a layer of something else. Yellow, salty, and oily. Butter. Real butter. Not margarine or lard. The sensation is so overwhelming that your salivary glands ache. The sugar hits your bloodstream almost instantly. You feel a flush of heat rise in your cheeks. For a moment, the mud, the lice, the barbed wire, it all recedes. There is only the taste of this alien, victorious food. And then the tears come. Not the panicked tears of the lineup, but hot, shameful tears of gratitude. You hate yourself for wanting another bite more than you want your freedom. In that moment, eating the enemy's bread, you realize the war is truly over. The Wehrmacht is gone. The Reich is ash. There is only this white, sweet softness and the American soldier watching you eat, wiping his hands on his trousers. The somatic legacy. The war didn't end when the gates opened. It lived on in the body. For the women released from the camps in late 1946 or 1947, freedom was not a sudden return to normalcy. It was a continuation of the hunger winter. The American white bread was a fleeting memory. The reality of post-war Germany was the ration card, specifically the Card 5 for the lowest category of consumers, often providing fewer than 1,000 calories a day. The most universal somatic legacy among these women was the silence of the womb. Amenorrhea, the cessation of menstruation, became the norm. The body, in its desperate attempt to keep the heart beating and the brain functioning, shut down non-essential systems. For young women in their early 20s, this was a source of quiet terror. Was it permanent? Had the starvation, the cold, or the stress broken something inside them forever? There were no doctors to ask. There was only the shared, whispered knowledge among friends that it hadn't come for 6 months, a year, 2 years. The monthly cycle, a marker of time and womanhood, simply vanished. Then came the hunger edema. It was a cruel physiological paradox. As you starved, you didn't just turn into a skeleton, you swelled. The lack of protein caused your body to retain water. Your ankles puffed up until they spilled over your shoes. Your face became round and moon-like. To an untrained eye, you might look healthy, even well-fed. But if you pressed a finger into the flesh of your calf, the dent remained, a pit in the doughy, waterlogged tissue that wouldn't spring back. You felt heavy, not light. Walking up a flight of stairs required a strategic pause on every landing to stop the black spots dancing in your vision. This was the Rubens figure of the apocalypse. Women with swollen bellies and stick-thin arms moving through the rubble of Cologne or Berlin with the slow, deliberate gait of the underwater diver. The golden cage had left its mark not just in memory, but in the very chemistry of their cells, a metabolic trauma that would take a decade to heal. The fraternization legacy. While the body remembered the hunger, the mind wrestled with a different kind of scar, the memory of survival intimacy. The official military policy was non-fraternization, the famous "don't speak to the locals" rule. But biology and economics ignored the orders. By 1946, a new somatic currency had emerged in the occupation zones, the nylon currency. For a Wehrmachthelferin returning to a bombed-out city, the contrast between the German men and the American soldiers was physically jarring. The German men returning from the East were broken, gray, often missing limbs, and smelling of defeat and dysentery. The Americans were vibrant, loud, and smelled of Old Spice aftershave, aggressive cleanliness, and Virginia tobacco. The term chocolate girl, or Ami Liebchen, became a label of both envy and scorn, but for many it was a calorie calculation. A relationship with a GI didn't just mean companionship, it meant access to the PX, post-exchange. It meant the difference between a winter coat and freezing. It meant Nescafe and cartons of Chesterfields, which could be traded on the black market for potatoes or coal. The intimacy was often transactional, a survival sex where the boundaries between affection and prostitution blurred. The physical memory of these encounters was complicated. It was the roughness of a wool blanket in the back of a Jeep, the taste of Hershey's chocolate melting on the tongue, a taste that would forever be associated with shame and relief. For decades after, the smell of American cigarettes or the sight of a chewing gum wrapper could trigger a visceral flashback to that gray zone. The women who bore children from these unions, the occupation babies, carried the visible proof of this history. And in the public baths or communal showers, the eyes of other women would drift to the legs of a neighbor looking for the sheen of real nylon stockings, the ultimate symbol that someone had crossed the line to survive. The intimate archive. History is usually written in ink. Treaties signed in Potsdam, borders drawn on maps, and the grand speeches of generals. But the true history of 1945 to 1948 was written in the body. It was written in the edema of the ankles, the scar tissue of the louse bites, and the permanent alteration of a palate that learned to crave the taste of white flour and sugar. The Wehrmachthelferinnen did not disappear into the history books as soldiers. They disappeared into the kitchens and offices of the new West Germany. They became the quiet grandmothers who saved every piece of string, who smoothed out aluminum foil to use again, who panicked if the pantry wasn't overflowing. They were the women who, even 50 years later, could not bear to throw away a crust of bread. When we look back at the American rule, we often see the Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, and the geopolitical chess game of the Cold War. But for the women who stood shivering in that schoolyard, the American rule was not a policy. It was a sensation. It was the smell of DDT and the shock of kindness from a stranger. It was the moment they realized that the conqueror did not bring a bayonet, but a clipboard and a calorie count. This somatic memory shaped the post-war world more than we admit. The West German economic miracle, Wirtschaftswunder, was built by women who started with nothing but a tin can stove and a pair of torn stockings. Their obsession with hygiene, their hunger for material security, and their deep, abiding fear of the cold were not cultural quirks. They were survival mechanisms honed in the mud of the Rhine meadows. The war ended with a bang, but the peace began with a whisper, the hiss of a spray pump, the crinkle of wax paper, and the quiet, steady chewing of bread that tasted like cake.